welcome. My name is Karim Dihi and I am the chair of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs Wellington branch. Founded in 1934 by former Prime Minister Walter Nash, the NZIIA is an independent, non-government organisation that exists to foster discussion and understanding of international issues and emerging trends, particularly as they relate to New Zealand. Tonight we're delighted to be here in the Beehive Theaterette to hear from Ms. Golriz Ghahraman, the second speaker in our Foreign Policy in Focus series. This series aims to explore in more depth the foreign policy perspectives of the different political parties which make up the current New Zealand Parliament. Before I introduce Golriz, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping and just mention the rules for the theaterette. If there is a fire, just evacuate the way that you came and follow the instructions of staff. If there's an earthquake, duck, cover and hold. There's no smoking on Parliament grounds, and if you could keep your phones on silent as well. And you might hear this evening the division bells sounding during Golriz's address, so don't panic when you hear those. Ms. Golriz Ghahraman is an Iranian Kiwi refugee and made history as the first ever refugee to be sworn in as an MP, having arrived in Aotearoa as a child asylum seeker with her family from Iran. Her studies at Oxford and her career as a lawyer in New Zealand and overseas have focused on enforcing human rights and holding governments to account. Her work has included restoring communities after war and human rights atrocities, particularly empowering women engaged in peace and justice initiatives. In New Zealand, she has successfully advocated on human rights issues before the Supreme Court. Before entering Parliament, Golriz was active in the NGO community, as reflected by her board and governance roles. She volunteered her skills to advance justice reform, refugees and migrant rights, and for family carers of disabled persons. She was part of the team that worked to prepare New Zealand's non-governmental report to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. In her first term as an MP, Golriz was a member of the Foreign Affairs, Trade and Defence and Education and Workforce Select Committees. Her work included successfully negotiating an end to New Zealand's military deployments in the Middle East, refocusing the work of our Defence Force on climate crisis, advocating for electoral funding reform, restoration of voting rights to prisoners serving 3 years or less, and doubling the number of refugee families reunified, as well as financial support to bring them together. Following her address, we'll open up the floor for questions, and at that time, just as a courtesy to the speaker, if you're able to give your name and affiliation, that would be appreciated. So I'd like to hand over to Golriz now. Thank you.
Ngā mana, ngā reo, ngā karangatanga maha, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, it was a humbling intro. Awkward to sit through, but thank you for that. I am actually currently also the member of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee, and it always seemed interesting to me that those three topics were seen and treated as being so intrinsically linked, though they may not in fact be in the minds of laypersons outside of this place. And I think that my experience of the sort of 2 terms of being on that committee, and I'll kind of come back to this, is that trade does rule. So we have foreign affairs, which is diplomacy, it's about human rights, it's war and peace as much as defence is. Then we have defence, and our defence forces don't necessarily always go to war, but they have, and of course the deployments were mentioned there. But we do environmental monitoring and disaster relief mostly. And all of those vast and differing topics sit together with trade in our committee. And again, my experience is that it is mostly about trade. There's also a perspective by the two major parties, and it is openly articulated, proudly articulated, that there is consensus across the House, or an expectation of consensus on foreign affairs, defence and trade issues by the main parties. So I often am the sole voice of dissent. There's no other small or medium-sized parties on that committee as far as I've served as an MP. So while the two major parties kind of fight over how good a trade deal is and who had more to do with how great it is, I'm often the one that might be saying it's not that good. It might actually be harmful. While they fight over how much more we need to pour into warplanes, I'm often the one that's sort of saying we might not need them. And then there's, foreign affairs, that kind of amorphous topic that we're here to discuss. So the Green Party perspective on all things, but I think this is quite pertinent to foreign affairs, is informed by our charter, and we've got 4 principles. They are about sustainability, social responsibility, which is also about recognising that resources are limited and need to be shared equally. About appropriate decision making, so that's democracy, and it's about those most impacted by decision being at the decision making table. And lastly, but by no means least, certainly not for someone who's lived through a war as a child, non-violence. And so I do come to foreign affairs as the first ever refugee MP, as I come into every room in this place and into the debating chamber and onto every stage, and I know that. But what that means is that I have an experience of displacement, which is one of the core crises facing not only those of us who are foreign affairs nerds, but the globe. I come to foreign affairs as someone who's seen bombs drop, well not quite, but heard them from basements and bunkers. As someone who has experienced that thing that a lot of the world feels, which is to say that our lives are not necessarily as valued as others, but not just as other lives, but as much as things like trade. And I come to foreign affairs as a lawyer, as an international criminal lawyer and a human rights lawyer, but that means that I have maybe a more zealous commitment to the international rules-based order as most domestic lawmakers, which was sometimes a surprise to me. It is important though. It does uphold an idea that there's equality in the globe, that there needs to be certainty about the rules, and that we do need to apply them consistently, otherwise none of us are going to be okay. Which brings me to all of the crises that I think foreign affairs needs to face. I say foreign affairs, maybe it's global affairs, maybe it's international affairs, but do nations even exist? So we'll say global. We have COVID. And the COVID crisis in New Zealand in particular, because we did have such a solid response, has taught us, should have taught us, that unless we are all okay, we won't be okay as a species, as a community. So we bring that lesson to the other crises that the globe is facing. Central to our green ethos is, of course, climate action and the climate crisis. That links us to one another. That means that policy cannot be isolationist. It can't be about us as a small island nation, although that is quite a good perspective when we look at the climate crisis. It's a small Pacific nation. We have a crisis of displacement, the refugee crisis. It wasn't put on hold while COVID raged. Displacement camps with millions of persons all over the world, and mostly in the global south, mostly in the so-called third world, kept coping with displacement, with war, with disease, and then with this new virus as we are isolated and bunkered down. And then we have human rights crises, we have war, we have the war in Ukraine now that New Zealand has taken notice of, but we also had the takeover by the Taliban of Afghanistan, we have Yemen still going, we have Syria still going, we had Myanmar fall, we had Hong Kong, and COVID kind of trumped all of that. But the lessons still stand. And I think in terms of discussing our approach as a nation and as Greens, the Pacific is a great example. It pulls together all of those things. And our work in the Pacific can be either exemplar of the world that we want to live in, the path that we want to forge, the different approach, the build back better stuff, or it can be business as usual. And sometimes I fear that that's kind of what we're doing. So in the Select Committee, where we talk mostly about trade and how defence and foreign affairs can aid trade, we did do last term an inquiry into New Zealand's humanitarian response in the Pacific. This term we're doing an inquiry into illegal fishing, because of course there's also a crisis in biodiversity, which sometimes gets a little bit relegated to like a second-class crisis as against the climate. But it is as important and it is interlinked. So those are the two inquiries that our Select Committee, our Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee has done, and they've both been focused on the Pacific because New Zealand is actually a Pacific nation. Now most of what we talk about in the press and in terms of foreign affairs more generally in the House is this kind of idea of, oh my God, is the Pacific falling to China? We don't necessarily talk about what the Pacific needs. We don't necessarily talk about what our climate needs, our environment needs. We don't talk about the biodiversity crisis. We don't talk about the way that the Pacific nations are coping with COVID. We talk about this kind of old world response where we talk in terms of who will take over the Pacific, as if that's a given. It's not a given. So if we live in a post-colonial, post-imperialist world, and we are a Pacific nation, we're actually an Asia-Pacific nation, how do we look to the Pacific in a way that's respectful and empowering? And there's two things that we haven't done that well, but we're kind of starting to work on. One was the waiver that third world nations called for when the COVID vaccine was first developed, and it's the TRIPS waiver. They asked for a waiver through the World Trade Organization rules where it is allowed of the IP, intellectual property costs of the vaccine, so that different manufacturers in different parts of the world could make the vaccine and could share it more cheaply. But with that, they asked for the waiver to apply to the other necessary equipment, chemicals and other essentials to providing the vaccine. We didn't support that. We didn't support it for a really long time, for like a year and a half. We think about the pandemic now being in its we're 2.5 years in. New Zealand didn't support that until there was a change of government in the United States, and they thought about it and they came out on social media. The US president supported it, and then New Zealand followed. And the way that we supported it was incredibly narrow. We supported the lifting of the vaccine IP, but nothing else. We refused to raise it in our trade negotiations with the EU. We refused to raise it with the UK, where the trade negotiations are now completed. And the TRIPS waiver is still in the air. We're not using any of our diplomatic or trade links to actually speak to this as a necessary part of the COVID response for us as a Pacific nation. Of course, we are giving in humanitarian aid in terms of the vaccine. Yeah. But is that empowering for the Pacific to continue to be continuously dependent on things as essential as vaccines? The likes of Australia, New Zealand, the EU, the UK, the newly emancipated UK from the common market, desperate for trading partners to come in and offer things as essential as vaccines. Are we surprised that the Pacific is looking to China? Don't they have a right to look to anywhere while they are not empowered and independent economically? Which brings me to the real call now in international affairs and in the post-colonial world that we keep saying we're in, which is debt relief. We know, and I've put this to our foreign affairs officials many times and to 2 consecutive foreign affairs ministers, and everybody agrees the EU has now made it a priority in their response to the Ukraine war, the Russian war. It's debt relief. The economic crisis caused by COVID and now the incredible insecurity in food and other supplies across the world because of war, because of the virus, the pandemic, is beyond aid. We have to look to debt relief. That, ideally, for me, for us, and I'm part of a coalition of lawmakers calling for forgiveness of debt, is forgiveness of debt, of third world debt. These are high-cost debts, they're debilitating, and quite often commercial entities like banks and international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF call for privatisation when debt can't be, the cost of debt can't be met. So they're causing a neoliberal chasm in the world that's keeping countries dependent, and it's happening in the Pacific. But moving down one step from that, there is the support that New Zealand can give to our Pacific neighbours, to the globe, in at least shifting the high-cost debt models to a lower-cost debt model. And we are doing that. MFAT has finally moved to at least trying to support that. And, you know, people keep saying, well, we don't actually lend that much. Well, that's okay. We apparently punch above our weight on international stages. How are we using that? How are we calling on our EU partners while we negotiate this trade agreement on the UK, while they were desperate for trading partners, while they're panicking about the Pacific falling to Asia? How are we telling them that actually empowering the Pacific economically is the way to ensure that any what are we meant to call them, developing world nations, any third world nation, actually isn't vulnerable to imperialist interests that we don't like? It shouldn't be a question of the United States versus China for New Zealand. And it has become that again in the past month or so. So we've declared an opaque, I'll call it, cooperation agreement with the United States military. We still have no details of that. It's cooperation on interoperationality. I wonder if that's surveillance. I fear that it might be. We are still part of the Five Eyes, which is something that the Green Party certainly opposes. It undermines our independence when we want to act as a mediator for peace in different conflicts. It undermines the progress that we as a global community are meant to have made to move away from the Cold War and those lines in the sand. It undermines us when we do call out our trading partners who are not our classic so-called allies. So our parliament stood together unanimously and called China out on the abuses against the Uyghur minority. That was good, and we supported that. But if we are to have the impact that we should have in upholding global rule of law and the human rights standards that do accord with our values, we need to be an independent, principled voice on the world stage again. We need to be able to call out the United States. We need to pull out of those deployments, which we did, and we need to say we're not going to be a tiny little partner in military operations in the Pacific with the United States as a response to the fear about China moving in. That fear is valid. But so is the fear when it comes of a militarized US presence in the Pacific, and that shouldn't be the choice. So, so in terms of what we can do in the Pacific, that's not all. Because what we do have as well, in terms of our own little trade and aid model, is itself worrying. So the Green Party's worried about trade, not because we don't like trade. New Zealand is a small island nation, we need trade. Trade actually does strengthen rule of law standards. It strengthens relationships that can lead to human rights standards being strengthened as well. What we are worried about is the lack of transparency around trade deals. We're worried about the lack of democratic process around the way that these trade deals are made. They come to Select Committee after they've been finalised. And that seems like a farce to me. Legislation doesn't get passed before it comes to Select Committee. But trade impacts every part of our lives. And this week I joined with the European Union Green Party parliamentarians to call on our governments, respectively, for a trade deal that's being negotiated now, and I have it on good authority that it will be finalised soon in principle, though not in text, for our climate obligations to be made central, for our commitment to workers' rights, women's rights, and Indigenous rights to be upheld. And people do say trade isn't about those things, it's about trade. Well, actually it's not. Because these deals are, the CPTPPA was about 6,000 pages long. It covered everything from our privacy rights to intellectual property. It made us promise not to regulate unknown technologies. And it meant that if we passed law or adopted policy that undermined the profit margins of international traders, that we would pay for their lost profit. That's not the way that democracy is meant to work. So we are worried. But in the Pacific, the way New Zealand does trade now is to move to a trade for aid model, increasingly. And that worries me for the most marginalised communities in the Pacific, for the rainbow community, for women, for Indigenous peoples, for those communities who benefit from humanitarian aid but don't necessarily engage in international trade. So if we move our money out of the types of development programs that we have been doing for years in partnership with organisations, entities, communities on the ground to a trade model, which we are doing, it may actively undermine development in the Pacific, and we're doing that at a moment that's actually quite worrying. Some of the other things that worry me in terms of New Zealand's approach to international affairs is our kind of complete detachment sometimes from the global refugee crisis. So we hadn't increased our refugee quota since 1986 until we did last term, and we doubled it. So it used to be 750 persons per year, and now it's 1,500 persons per year. We haven't filled our quota for the past 2 years because we closed the borders, there was a pandemic. We won't backfill, the new minister says. And the 1,500, as it stands, places us, in terms of refugee resettlement commitment per capita, below well below Australia. So we don't torture asylum seekers on prison islands, but we don't resettle nearly as many refugees that come through the United Nations system as Australia. And Australia isn't a refugee supporting nation, right? We are way below Canada, that other nation with that other big bad neighbour that we compare ourselves to all the time. The Green Party policy on the refugee crisis is that we double it again, our annual quota, and we increase it again to 4,000. We do that in a staggered way so that we build the infrastructure and wraparound support that we need for proper, successful, supportive, inclusive resettlement. 4,000 would mean that we do a bit more than Australia per capita, but still markedly below Canada. So it's not super progressive, but it's respectable. We did work with Labour last term to double the number of families being reunified. So those are people who are separated from their refugee loved ones here in New Zealand. There's about a 2 to 4 year wait, so it's not even particularly real, that hope, but it is something, and we got the funding for the very first time ever to actually pay for the families to be reunified. Until then, we were treating the refugee, and it was only ever really sole refugees who were able to get on that wait list and bring their loved ones. If you were second tier, you didn't even have a hope, because 300 per year was just so low. But so a sole person who has arrived here as a quota refugee had to save up for the flights, for the visa fees. They were treated as immigrants, not refugees, so it was the legal fee, everything, and it was taking 2 to 4 years for people. So we finally have the government setting aside a budget just to reunify immediate family with a lone person here, and there's only 600 per year. So I think that New Zealand is so removed from that crisis as to be behaving in a way that's antithetical to our values. Most New Zealanders actually want us to welcome more refugees. Most New Zealanders want us to have a community placement model, where Canada, for example, allows 4 households to join together to sponsor a refugee, for organisations to do the same, for us to have a quota that's more in line with the way that we want to pull our weight and do our fair share to respond to the refugee crisis. And nothing has kind of highlighted that support as much as the Ukraine crisis. So we've sent military support, which seems odd to me without a debate. We're now involved in a war, but we haven't sent nearly as much in terms of aid for the displacement crisis, and we've allowed 4,000 people to join their immediate families, but we haven't said that will apply to those most at risk or raised our quota. In response to what's happened in Afghanistan, we sent a Hercules plane into Kabul airport when no one could get in or get out. We're one of the few. We didn't fill it. We left seats empty while we only took home our own. And that breaks my heart, and it broke the hearts of Afghan New Zealanders. So we have started to bring in some at-risk Afghans, and I've met with them, the female journalists, judges, women that worked for the previous government. They are here alone. So we haven't applied the principle of keeping families together even to those most at risk. There is an anxiety that will impact their mental health for years and years to come if we don't act now to say actually refugee resettlement, a response to displacement, needs to be humane and not just about numbers. And to finish, something that's close to my heart as much as the refugee crisis is, which is war. What I would love to see is that New Zealand not only accede to, for example, nuclear non-proliferation treaties or to negotiate autonomous weapons bans, but to actually divest from investments that help the war industries. because we know that our super fund, banks that operate in New Zealand, numerous other government